Okay, so I'm going to talk about like various ways of approaching self-supervised learning. And really the problem I'm after is the type of learning that we observe in humans and animals in the way they can sort of learn how the world works or apprehend the world. And I give some examples during the talk of how we can use SSL to get systems to really understand how the world works and perhaps plan actions and things of that type. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to look very much in line with what both Eero and Yi talked about at the philosophical level, at least, or maybe even at the more detailed level. So humans learn basic concepts about the world mostly by observation in the first few months, and then a little bit by interaction. But a lot of it takes place by observation. How much can we learn from the world just by observation? And there's a lot of people now who are, strangely perhaps, convinced that you can learn everything from language. People who think we're going to get to human level AI by just scaling up LLMs, and I think that's complete BS, because you can make very simple estimation here, and those are like maybe there's an order of magnitude of 2 that is not entirely correct, but the big LLMs these days are trained on typically 10 to the 13 tokens, 30 trillion tokens. And the token is about 3 bytes, so that's roughly 10 to the 14 bytes. And that would take any of us, 500,000 years or something to read through that. It's all the publicly available text on the internet. A human child, a 4-year-old, has been awake 16,000 hours, which, by the way, is a small amount of data. It's about 30 minutes of YouTube uploads. And we have 2 million optical nerve fibers getting to our visual cortex, carrying each about 1 byte per second. There may be an order of magnitude error in that estimate, but it's roughly what you could imagine being approximately correct. And so do the arithmetics, and you get to 10 to the 14 bytes in 4 years instead of 400,000 years. Now, what that tells you is, we're not going to get to human level AI by just training on text. There's just a lot of things that we learn about the world that has nothing to do with language. And it's obviously true of humans, but it's even more true of animals, particularly because they don't have language, most of them. Now, of course, visual signals are highly redundant, but that's kind of the whole point of SSL. You cannot, and the point that was made by both Eero and Yi, you cannot learn from random signals. You have to have some structure and redundancy in the signal if you want the system to be able to discover any kind of structure in it. So SSL really thrives on redundancy, and Barlow is our ancestor there. Okay, so if SSL really is finding structure in data, how do we formalize this idea? And the instinct would be, well, let's try to estimate distributions, densities, right? That's kind of an immediate thing. But I've become over the last several decades very skeptical about this, because about trying to estimate densities in high-dimensional spaces is basically an intractable problem, because you have to kind of parameterize the distribution, make sure it's normalized, and the physicists among us, which I'm not, know that this is intractable. They've come up with all kinds of methods to kind of get around the problem of the fact that the normalization constant cannot be computed. Some people in the room, I know for a fact, actually did their PhD or postdoc on this. Lawrence. Variational methods. So a weaker way of finding dependencies between variables is through a simple mechanism, not a density, but an energy function, right? So you have, let's say, 2 scalar variables here. And let's say your data points are those black dots. Obviously, there is no functional relationship that allows you to predict y from x or x from y, because it's just a dependency that is not a function, right? There are multiple y's that are possible for a given x, right? This guy, and this guy for this particular value of x, possibly even an infinite number. So the way to capture those dependencies is through perhaps some sort of energy function. We call it energy by analogy with physics, because it's the same math in the end. So basically, try to find an energy function that takes low values on the data manifold, if you think it's a manifold, and then higher values outside. And the next question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we train a model of this type? But basically, it's a model in which the output of the system is not computed by running through a few layers of a neural net, but it's by search. Okay, so you have this energy function, or call it a free energy if you want, that captures the dependency between x and y. And if you observe part of the input, let's say x, and you want to infer y, then you search for a value of y that minimizes f of xy. Okay, there might be multiple. If f is continuous, you might use gradient-based methods. If it's not, you might use other types of search, but it's the process by which inference proceeds by optimization. This is computationally intrinsically more powerful than inference by running through a bunch of layers of a neural net. So I think AI systems of the near future will have to basically work this way, not predicting tokens with a running through a bunch of layers of neural net, but basically searching by inference. And some AI systems actually currently do this. Right. So to train, you need to shape this energy function, and of course, this energy function can contain some gigantic neural net. But we'll see about that in a second. And so that's the basic difference between sort of traditional approaches, if you want, to machine learning, where you learn a map, a function from input to output. Here, we just have a dependency function, and we need to do a search in output space for an output that is compatible with the input that we currently observe. Now, this type of inference is very common in a lot of previous approaches or all kinds of different approaches to AI. Classical AI is all about search in solution space for one that satisfies a number of criteria. Path planning is search, combinatorial search for block world, terrorism, Hanoi, SAT, all of this. This is all search, right? Probabilistic inference in graphical models is all about finding a configuration of variables you don't know that is the most likely given the ones that you do know. So that's called energy-based models. Some people call energy-based model a version of this that actually produces a distribution. I don't insist on producing a distribution, but you have two versions of it, conditional and unconditional. So conditional is when there's a subset of the variables that you know you will always observe. So call this an input. And then a set of variables you know you will most likely be asked to predict. Call that y. But you may have unconditional versions. So here you only have a y. You never know which part you're going to know in y and which part you're going to have to predict. Okay. And mathematically, the two are equivalent, except you get rid of the x in the formulas for one, and you get the unconditional version. So all of unsupervised learning, basically, from the past, is sort of some version of this. And of course, you cannot always turn, but you can sometimes turn an energy-based model into a probabilistic model through a Gibbs distribution, where P of y given x is exponential minus some constant times the energy, and then you have to normalize. The problem, of course, is that this normalization constant may be intractable, and so we're not going to even try to do this. Okay, and in fact, it's probably a bad idea to do this because I think Eros and you were talking about, like, what if the data is a thin manifold? If the data is a thin manifold, the maximum likelihood solution of your model is a density that is infinite on your manifold and zero outside. Okay, in terms of energy, it needs to be zero, let's say, on the manifold, and infinite, just epsilon outside. And so what are you to do? Well, you can do what Arrow recommends. You fuzzify your manifold, and now you have some sort of density. But you're not doing density estimation anymore, right? It's not your it's not the data that you're trying to fit. You're trying to fit your, kind of nosified version of the data. And the math obviously is correct, but basically, why not just directly view the problem of learning an energy function, which may or may not be the log of some density? It doesn't matter, but what it needs to be is relatively differentiable, smooth, and continuous. And you're not going to get that if you do maximum likelihood without some regularization of some kind. If you train your energy system without any kind of, and the data is a thin manifold, your energy function is going to be a very, very thin canyon, which is going to be useless for inference. So this is basically an argument against probabilistic modeling. You can have energy function with latent variable, but let's skip over that. Okay, so now how do we train energy-based models? There is only two classes of methods that I know, really. One class of method is contrastive method. So basically, you have your data point here, which is where your energy function should take low values. And then you somehow generate contrastive samples, those flashing green points, whose energy you're going to push up. Okay. Now, there's an issue with this kind of method, even though I contributed to inventing them in some context many years ago. I became very kind of negative about them, because if your energy surface is very flexible, the number of contrastive points you're going to have to use to push up your energy function grows exponentially with the dimension of the space. And so that's not going to work very well if you want to learn high representations in high dimensional spaces, basically. And I'm talking about the representation space here, not necessarily the input space. But in fact, I have to do this input space as well. So I prefer those regularized methods where basically, can you come up with a constraint on the architecture or some regularization term in such a way that the volume of stuff that can take low energy is small or minimized, in such a way that when you push down the energy of certain regions of the space, the rest has to go up because there is only a small amount of low energy space to go around. And the reason you need to do this contrastive methods or regularized method is because of collapse. If you have a flexible energy function and you push down on the energy of the training sample without doing anything else, you might end up with a flat energy surface, which is a terrible way of capturing dependencies between your variables. And in fact, collapse occurs in a lot of very common situations, and a lot of what techniques that people have devised over the years is basically collapse prevention, right? So if you have a predictive model, okay, that predicts y from x, or a generative architecture where y and x are really the same nature, the sort of different parts of the input, you can't have a collapse because you're basically training the thing to just predict the output, and there's only one output that will be correct. If you have a latent variable model, it can collapse. If the latent variable has too much information, then it can capture all the information there is to capture to predict the output, and then this can collapse. Basically, there's always one value of the latent variable that will produce a zero prediction error, and that's another form of collapse. So you need to regularize your latent variable so that this information content is limited. This is what you get with sparse coding and things of that type, although sparse coding doesn't have a conditional version. Autoencoders obviously collapse. An autoencoder can learn the identity function, and that's a collapsed model that doesn't actually capture anything about the mutual dependencies of the inputs. And so you need to have some ways of preventing autoencoders from collapsing, which is why people are using sparse autoencoders, denoising autoencoders, variational autoencoders, all kinds of different types of autoencoders, maxed autoencoders, right? This is for collapse prevention. And then you have joint embedding architecture, so things where you don't actually predict y, you predict some representation of y from the representation of x. An example is Siamese nets, and that can collapse, obviously, because the system can choose to completely ignore the inputs and then satisfy whatever condition you need to satisfy between Sx and Sy, like making them equal for x and y that are compatible, for example. So people have been rediscovering contrastive methods in this context, and that's why they've become more kind of part of the current vocabulary. So again, those two methods, contrastive or regularized. And I've made a list of all kinds of methods, classical or less classical, classified as to whether they are contrastive or not. So things like maximum likelihood methods with Markov-Chain Monte Carlo or Monte Carlo methods for contrastive samples are contrastive. Contrastive divergence, Siamese nets with metric learning or CLIP or things of that type, and all kinds of other things, adversarial methods like GANs. These are all contrastive. Things like masked autoencoders, diffusion models, denoising autoencoders, etc. MAE, BERT, that's all contrastive. And then the regularized method is less clear. Like they use all different strategies to kind of not collapse essentially. But you can interpret them in those terms. So PCA, k-means, Gaussian mixture model, square ICN, normalizing flow, blah, blah, blah. And then other more exotic techniques like sparse autoencoders, variational autoencoders, VQVAE, etc. So I'll argue that for SSL, I think we should basically bet on those rather than those. Okay, so collapse prevention in various cases. Collapse prevention can be done through architectural constraints. That's probably the simplest way to do it. And that's basically what LLMs are doing. Okay, you can think of LLM as autoencoders. An LLM is an autoencoder. You think of it as a predictor for the next token, but really no, they are trained as autoencoders. You take a sequence of tokens, you run it through an architecture which is designed in such a way that a particular output cannot look at its corresponding input. It can only look at the inputs to the left of it. Okay, that's called a causal architecture, right? So the GPT style architectures are like this. They're not the unique way to do this, but they are like that. And now if you train this as an autoencoder, since you don't have a path between an input and the corresponding output, you implicitly train the system to make predictions. Okay, but you can think of the architecture as basically doing an implicit masking by the architecture. Okay, but really it's an autoencoder. Another collapse prevention technique which applies to autoencoders and other architectures is denoising autoencoders. And this is a very, very old idea. Actually, I had this in my PhD, it's going back 1987. But it's the idea that you take a data point, you corrupt it in some ways, and then you train an autoencoder to reconstruct the original point from the corrupted version. So that's denoising autoencoder. If you do it right, there's some issues with it, but you can be smart about it. But if you instead of training the system to recover the original point directly, you only train it to move a little bit towards the manifold, you get diffusion models. That's basically what a diffusion model is. You train a neural net to basically, for every point in the space, give you a vector that takes you towards the manifold, right? Okay, here. So let's look at this idea of training by reconstruction from a corrupted version of the input, explicitly corrupted version of the input. So things like BERT, masked autoencoder, denoising autoencoders work this way. This works really well for text, although not as well as the architectural constrained version of it. But it doesn't really work for images. So I made a point in a comment earlier, this idea of a masked autoencoder, where you take an image or a video or whatever, you corrupt it by masking it partially, and then you train some gigantic neural net to predict the parts that are missing. It doesn't really work for images and video. Our colleagues at FAIR, as I said, boiled a number of small lakes on the West Coast to try to make it work. Spent a huge amount of computation. It just doesn't work very well. And it doesn't work very well because the prediction problem is really hard. Like, reconstructing missing parts of an image or a video, if you make it sufficiently complicated that you get useful representation, it really doesn't work very well. And we have tons of evidence for why that's the case. Here's another example of contrastive method of collapse prevention technique that now applies to those joint embedding architectures that do not attempt to reconstruct, but basically encode both X and Y and try to reconstruct at the representation level. I'm going to come back to this concept because it's super important. But there it became apparent, back in the early 90s when we worked on Siamese nets, that a good way of training those systems was through a contrastive method. So show it pairs of images that are semantically identical, and then produce representations that are as close as each other as you can, and then simultaneously show pairs that are different, and then push those away. Okay. You can also push them away at a kind of global scale, perhaps like enforce the overall variance of the representations to be large. And if you don't run a function, you want to run an embedding, you get local linear embedding. Lawrence is here. So the type of loss functions you can use for a contrastive method, there is a whole bunch of them. People tend to use just what they call Inference, which is the one at the top, but there is like a whole bunch of them you can imagine. Okay, but the question really is, can we train generative architectures from video? And the short answer to this is absolutely not. If you get one message from this talk, it is that. Do not train generative architectures on images or video. It does not work. Or at least it doesn't work as well as the other stuff you can do, okay? I mean, of course, people have tried, and this is basically, this was at some point when Jeff Hinton, started playing with backprop. Like the big idea was that we were going to be able to train multi-layer net to learn, representations either as autoencoders or predictors, and it never really worked, and it still doesn't work, right? I mean, VAEs are cool, but like if you want to learn a representation of images that gives you decent results on any kind of downstream task, VAEs totally suck. PQVAE even more, and MAE not only sucks, but requires 10,000 GPUs to give you the answer. So, okay, so this needs to be abandoned. And the reason it needs to be abandoned is because predicting the details of a missing image or video is just an impossible problem to solve. If you train, and this is, some work, that goes back almost 10 years now, with Camille Coupry and Michael Mathieu, we tried to train some big neural nets for the time to do video prediction on short video sequences, and you get blurry predictions. Why? Because you can't exactly predict what's going on in the video, and so the system just predicts the average. Okay, and that's a blurry image because all kinds of things could happen. We try to mitigate the issue with sort of latent variable model, and that's an example where it does work. So this is a prediction without latent variable, and if you add latent variables that parameterize the manifold of possible predictions, you get CRISPR prediction, but it only works for basically synthetic videos like this. They're not synthetic, but they are like, semantic kind of videos, not actual natural videos. So my solution is joint embedding predictive architecture. It's this. And the difference with the previous one is that you have an encoder for Y now. Okay, so instead of training a system to predict all the details of what goes on in the video, you train the system to learn a representation of the video and then make predictions in that representation space. Okay, the type of transformation that can take place between here and here could be, partial masking. So if you mask the future, or if you mask the second half of a video, now you're training the system to do future prediction, basically. But you could imagine all kinds of different other things. This could represent an action that is taking place in the video. And this is, before the action, after the action, or something like that, or vice versa. But anyway, so now the problem is predicting in representation space, which may be a much simpler problem. Why is it a simpler problem? Because you can eliminate through the encoder a lot of details from the input that really are not predictable. Okay. So this is I don't know if that fits with any sort of classical predictive coding models in neuroscience. My sense is that predictive coding was much more about more generative architectures where you predict every pixels. So here you try to lift the representation to some abstraction level within which you can make predictions. And I'll come back to that concept because I think it's really kind of crucial and important for intelligence, really. So here's the difference. Generative architectures, joint embedding predictive architectures. I think we should just drop this for high-dimensional continuous inputs. It works for text because text is discrete, so you can make prediction in discrete domains and estimate distributions, that's fine. But in high-dimensional continuous space, we hit this intractable issue. And so there you have to learn abstract representations to be able to do things. So if we're going to work with natural signals as opposed to text, we're going to have to abandon generative architectures, which is funny because everybody is talking about generative AI. And it's not making me very popular among some of my colleagues. But I'm used to being unpopular. So there's several flavors of this, the simple joint embedding with shared weights, that's Siamese nets. the predictive ones that attempt to predict the representation of y from that of x, which might be interesting. And then the more sophisticated one where you have a variable that may represent what you don't know about the environment, like a latent variable, or may represent maybe an action that is taking place between the observation x and the next observation y, for example. That's what we call a world model, and I'll come back to this. So that's kind of the general architecture. If you try to kind of lift that up a little bit, your predictor might be conditioned on an action that you know is taking place in the world. There may be a latent variable that represents everything you don't know about the world. There should be a cost function for training and inference that is the prediction error of sy given sx, but you might need other criteria to train this model in various ways. And the main issue that you're going to have to solve here is the collapse problem. Okay, so again, if you train a system of this type, you're not careful, the system will happily just ignore x and y, produce constant sx and sy, and then of course the prediction is trivial. What was the quote, Arrow? From Bill Bialek, like kill yourself, right? Exactly. So, okay, we don't want to kill ourselves, or models for that matter. Okay, so here is a way to prevent collapse that really works very well, but nobody knows why, okay? Or at least not in convincing ways. And it's a trick that a few people stumbled on in sort of ways that I don't fully understand. This is a technique called BYOL from DeepMind, SimSiam from our colleagues at FAIR. Deno, to some extent, uses this. And then IJEPA, VJEPA that work pretty well, which I'm not going to go into the details of because I think Nicola is going to talk about this later. But basically, you have two encoders. They kind of share the same weights, but not really. So this encoder gets weights that are basically a running average of the weights of that encoder over time. Okay, so it gets kind of weights that change slowly. And you don't backpropagate gradient to this half, you only propagate gradient to that half. But for some reason, if you're lucky, it prevents collapse. There are some theoretical papers, at least one is another one coming up by Yang Dongtian, Soya Ganguly, and Shoyada, I think, from FAIR that attempts to show why it doesn't collapse. What they show is that in the case where the encoder and predictor are linear, there are fixed points of the learning dynamics that are not collapse points, right? But solutions. Now, this is what Deno is based on, and as Philippe was talking about this morning, this works really, really well. Deno uses another trick, which is to kind of quantize the output and turn it into a classification problem, but it works really well. It produces generic features that are amazing. And there's a latest paper that Nicola will talk about, where if you scale up, and Philippe, I think, mentioned that too, if you scale up the size of the network and the training data with a Deno-style learning algorithm, you get systems that, for a very wide range of tasks, basically beat the performance of supervised learning. Okay, so this is the first example where you clearly have evidence that self-supervised learning for image feature representation learning actually beats purely supervised. It was a big debate, actually, in the vision community whether that was going to be the case, and it is. So one reason we might want to train those JEPA architectures is that they're a perfect model for building a system that learns to act in the world by planning a sequence of actions. And I've written sort of a vision paper where I think AI research should go over the next 10 years, which I put on open review. It's not on archive. So here's why it could be useful. And again, this connects with those energy-based models I was telling you about before. Let's assume you observe the world through a perception module. You get some idea of the initial state of the world, a representation of the state of the world. You might want to combine this with the content of a memory that contains your idea of the state of the world you don't currently perceive, okay, outside this room, for example. That goes into a world model. And so that's a kind of predictor, similar to the one I was mentioning before. And what this world model is supposed to do is, given an action sequence that you imagine taking, or that someone might be taking, can you predict the next state of the world, or a sequence of state that the world is going to go through as a result of taking this sequence of actions? If you had this way of making this kind of prediction, you could plug that final imagined state of the world, if you want, through a bunch of objectives characterizing whether a task has been accomplished, and maybe measuring to what extent the sequence of states is dangerous or good or bad or whatever. And then by optimization, by search, now you can figure out a sequence of actions that will minimize those objectives according to the predictions of your world model. This is a pretty good model of what psychologists call system 2 reasoning in humans, right? So the kind of task that you accomplish deliberately and consciously by kind of thinking about it beforehand and imagining what the consequences of your action will be, as opposed to sort of reactive reactions. This is, I think, also a good model of how we do science. I mean, when we do science, we might have a bunch of observations about a phenomenon we're trying to study, but like the biggest complicated thing to do is simultaneously to find a good representation of the observation that capture what we're interested in, and that allows us to make predictions. Okay, and building the models, once you have the good representation, is not that hard in the end. For example, I can dump all the data that we know about the planet Jupiter on you, and then I can ask you, like, can you predict the position of Jupiter 100 years from now? And it turns out you don't need much of the data I will dump on you about Jupiter. You don't need. The only thing you need to know is 6 numbers: 3 positions, 3 velocities. And you can make long-term prediction about where Jupiter is going to be. You don't need to know its size, its density, its temperature, its, how many moons it has or whatever. Completely irrelevant. And so really the problem of science is finding good representations in addition to modeling. Now, if you have a model of the world, you can probably apply it recursively or autoregressively to, in multiple steps, so that if you take a sequence of actions, you can feed the action multiple times to your world model and then predict kind of a sequence of trajectory. This is very classical in optimal control. Optimal control, the world model is written by hand, but what we're talking about here is basically learning the model and planning a sequence of actions to arrive at a particular goal in this condition in optimal control. It's called model predictive control. It's a very classical thing. The world is not entirely predictable, so you may have to add latent variables to your world model. And that makes it more complicated. But let me give you an example of how this works. So in this case, what we've done is we've used the Deno encoder as a way to kind of extract a representation of the state of the world. So this is work by Kathy Zhu, Hengai Pan. Kathy is a student co-advised by Laurel Pinto and me. Laurel is at NYU. And what she did was take Deno features and then train a predictive world model in representation space that, given an action, can predict what the next state of the world is going to be. Okay, so let's say you have a bunch of blue chips on the board, and you have a robot, and the robot makes an action. It kind of moves its arm in a particular way. It's going to move the chips in a particular position. Can you train a neural net to basically make that prediction conditioned on the action? And then subsequently, can you use it to plan a sequence of actions to arrive at a particular thing? So you do this, observe an initial condition, run it through the Deno encoder, then run your world model multiple time steps with sort of hypothesized action sequence. And then there is a distance measure at the end that measures the distance of the final state to a target state that you want to obtain. And then by optimization, by search, figure out a sequence of actions that minimize that distance. And this actually works. It works better than other stuff people have tried in this context, but let me just show you the punchline in the video. So here is a cool little situation. You have randomly moved blue chips, and these are target that the system is supposed to plan a sequence of actions to reach. And this is the sequence of actions that are planned, and the result that they produce. It's not bad. And the dynamics of that system is really complicated. So it's not something that you could, kind of reduce to a few equations through which you could backpropagate. This has been applied to a number of different situations for planning, and it's not specific to this. This I'm going to go extremely fast on because Nicolas is going to talk about it. But basically, using this EMA technique, distillation method to train image features and video features, and it works really well. But let me skip ahead. It's much faster than MAE. So MAE is the black square, and the circles is this JEPA method, and the x-axis is number of GPU hours trained on used for pre-training, and the y-axis is top 1% accuracy on ImageNet. Then there's a video version of this, which works by basically masking a big chunk of the video. It's actually a temporal tube, and then training this JEPA using the EMA trick. And again, you get pretty good representations that are, give you really good performance. And surprisingly, and again, Nicolas will talk about this, if you take this model, this VJEPA model, and you feed it videos that are impossible, where something really unusual occurs, like an object disappears spontaneously, or it changes shape, or something is not physically possible, and you measure the prediction error as you kind of slide the window of this model over the sequence, the prediction error spikes. And so those systems basically have, by just being trained on natural video, have discovered some sort of intuitive physics that allows them to tell us whether a video is possible or not. And I'll let Nicolas give you some details about this. I just spoiled his entire talk. Okay, there is the stuff I really want to talk about. And it's training the JEPA with regularized methods. So we heard from Yi earlier about MCR squared. A few years ago, we had a technique that we produced, actually inspired by Barlow, really, with idea came from Stefan Denis, who is now at University of Aalto in Finland. And we call this Barlow twins, and it was some sort of way of maximizing the information content that comes out of the encoder of the JEPA architecture. A bunch of people have had similar ideas. VCReg is a method that Adrien Bard, Jean Ponce, and I proposed shortly after Barlow twins, which is basically a simplified version of Barlow twins, but kind of works better. And then various versions of it. And then MNCR that Aero and Soyoung Chung proposed that is, and Yilun, where's Yilun? I don't see Yilun. He was there this morning. Oh, here you are. You're there too. Okay. Okay, so basically the trick to prevent collapse here is to have some measure of information content and maximize it, okay, to prevent this thing from collapsing. Now, here's the issue. To maximize something, we need to either be able to compute it or at least have a lower bound on it, okay? And we cannot compute information content, and we sure as hell don't have lower bounds. We only have upper bounds. Why do we have only upper bounds? It's because when you're shown a bunch of vectors and you're being asked, like, what's the information content in that vector? That depends on the assumptions you're making about independence between variables, pairwise or groups of variables. And so if you make an assumption about what kind of dependence is possible, you basically overestimate the information content because you're ignoring complicated dependencies between those variables. So we don't have lower bounds on information. So we're not going to be able to maximize information. We're just going to cross our fingers. All right. How do we do that? Basically use all the intuitive tricks that both Aero and Yi mentioned. Try to kind of produce a representation that sort of fills the space and maybe kind of discovers the low-dimensional structure inside of your inputs. Blah blah blah. And we're not going to use contrastive methods because, or at least sample contrastive methods. In fact, we have two basic ways to do this. So let's say we have a matrix of samples coming out of our encoder. Let's say over a batch or something like this. Sample contrastive method will take each row of this matrix and try to make them all different from each other, right? So this is the idea that you should have different representations for different input vectors and push them away from each other, basically. And that's a way of kind of maximizing their information content. But again, if you apply this to things like images, the only representations that you get have low dimensional intrinsic dimension. An image net typically is 200. Now there's the alternative is regularized method or non-contrastive method or other Infomax methods, which basically are also contrastive, but on the variables, not on the samples. So take the columns of this matrix and try to make the columns as orthogonal to each other as possible. First of all, make sure they're not all zero, right? So make sure the variance or standard deviation of the samples over a batch is at least 1, let's say, or 1, okay? And then make sure that the columns are orthogonal to each other, which means the variables are uncorrelated. Now, that doesn't capture all the dependencies, which is why this is an upper bound on information content. But what that means in the end is that you're computing basically the covariance matrix of this guy. Take this matrix, compute this transpose, and multiply the transpose by itself. You get the covariance matrix. Try to make the covariance matrix as close to the identity as possible, okay? And both MCR squared and MCR and VCReg do that in different ways and variations. Now, the sample contrastive method is basically the same thing, except not with the covariance matrix, but with the gram matrix, right? So take that matrix, multiply it by its transpose. Now you get a gram matrix, right? Computes the dot product of all the samples, and try to make that as close to the identity as possible. That's what contrastive methods are. So we have a paper by my future ex-student, Quentin Garrido, who is graduating soon, that shows there is really duality between those two things because they have, the matrices are the same singular values, blah, blah, blah. They're not completely equivalent depending on the relative size of the dimension and the number of samples that you do this over, but basically they kind of more or less work the same if you are careful. We need to examine this further because I don't pretend to understand everything. So VCReg basically are those two criteria: make the diagonal terms of the covariance matrix as close to 1 as possible, or at least larger than 1, and then make the off-diagonal terms as close to 0 as possible. You can use a trick by sort of doing this not in the space of representation, but in an expanded space where this is a neural net with more outputs than it has input, and you get some level of independence. And we have some theoretical papers that show it's the same argument as ICA, basically. If you have some nonlinear transform of variables and you make them uncorrelated, you actually make the variables independent. I'm not going to bore you with details or with variations of this or with versions to use this in the context of not only trying to learn invariant representations, but also equivariant representations that change with the pose. Skip over that. And then a more recent thing, which is still work in progress to a large extent, where we can train a world model with this VC regularization technique, and then use it for planning in simple cases at least. It's not as sophisticated as the Deno world model, but it's trained end-to-end completely self-supervised. So you observe trajectories. They could be expert trajectories or not, doesn't matter. So there are kind of sequences of observations. You run them through an encoder, and you have also a predictor that is trying to predict, basically minimize the distance between the observed representation of the input and the predicted one. And you do this not at one step, but at multiple steps. Actually, I think in the experiment, we do it at 16 or 17 steps. And this is all conditioned by action. So you know which action is being accomplished in this kind of virtual world that you're observing. And you prevent the system from collapsing using this VC regularization laws, okay? And once you have this model, you use it for planning a sequence of actions to arrive at a particular goal, and it kind of works. This is supposed to be an animation, but it's not animating. But anyway, so simple cases where the system is faced with a new maze that it sees from the top, basically a top-down view, and it tries to kind of figure out a trajectory to a particular goal. There's some theoretical work on sort of analyzing how those VCReg thing and Infomax regularizations work in terms of information theory. by Ravid Zif, who is sitting right here. So if you have questions about this, you should raise your hand higher. That's a long paper. Okay, so this whole idea that we should find abstract representations, I think, is not interesting just for AI or planning or whatever, but also for science. I mean, this is what we do in science, as I was pointing out earlier. And I think these JEPA models could be really useful for building models of observational scientific data. I'm actually working with some folks here. Where's Helen? Are you here, Helen? Helen, working on something along those lines here with Shirley Ho. And it's really a concept. I mean, the idea that to understand the world, we elaborate various levels of abstract representations to really comprehend the world is necessary, if not natural, in the sense that we could explain everything going on in this room right now in terms of quantum field theory, in principle. Okay, but computationally, that would be completely intractable and probably useless, right? So we invent abstract representation levels to allow us to make predictions that are easier, longer term, more reliable, but with fewer details. Okay. From quantum fields, we can go to particles and atoms and molecules and materials, objects, machines, whatever. And then for the living, it's more like proteins, organelles, cells, organisms, individuals, societies, etc. Right. So we have those various levels of abstract representation that that's really kind of fundamental to the process of understanding the world in the context of science as well as kind of natural intelligence, really. Let me conclude. So there is a way to kind of arrange the system and train them so that those kind of encoder and predictor system in such a way that you can do this at the sequence level. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but we're trying to find an efficient recipe that would scale as well as things like GPT-style architectures and things like that to train those world models and make it sort of a universal tool. You can just turn the crank on. Okay, so here are my recommendations. If you are interested in kind of learning models of natural data, abandon generative models in favor of those JEPA, abandon probabilistic modeling in favor of those energy-based views, abandon contrastive methods in favor of regularized methods. And of course, I've been saying that for 12 years, abandon reinforcement learning, or at least minimize its use as much as you can because it's so damn inefficient. And you should replace this by learning good models of the world and then using those world models to plan sequences of actions that does not necessarily require any kind of RL style online adjustment. So if you're interested in human level AI, just do not work on LLMs, it's pointless. Also, you're going to be in competition with enormous teams of hundreds of engineers and scientists having access to tens of thousands of GPUs like this. If you are in an academic context, there is no way you can contribute. Instead, work on JEPA, self-supervised learning, world models, and planning. Thank you very much.